Welcome to Age Pension, Super and Retirement. I am your host Yvonne, and as always, this podcast is information only and not personal advice. In today's episode, we will be looking at rent assistance and income from boarders and lodgers. To unpack this topic, I'd like to welcome back Rebecca.
Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, good to be here again.
It is good to be here, and for the listeners, if they hear any distant roadworks, I say apologies in advance. Let's see how the sound goes. Now, just to begin with, Rebecca, what is rent assistance and who actually gets it?
So rent assistance is a payment from the Commonwealth. So sometimes it's called Commonwealth Rent Assistance, and it is like a rent subsidy. It's a little bit of extra money to help subsidise your rent, help pay your rent. Who can get it? It's always linked with a Centrelink payment of some sort. All of the income support payments, so that's things like job seeker, age pension, Oz study, youth allowance, carer payment. You can get rent assistance with any of those payments if you're on one of those payments. And the other one is family tax benefit. So family tax benefit is a payment for people with dependent children, and if you're paying rent, you can get rent assistance paid with your family tax benefit. That's paid to certain income levels. There is an income test for family tax benefit, so not everyone is eligible, but if you're a lower or middle income family, you can probably get some family tax benefit, including rent assistance if you're paying rent. You have to be paying rent to get rent assistance. It's not available if you have a mortgage. Even if your mortgage is high, some people say, I'm on job seeker and I've got a mortgage, and why can't I get mortgage assistance? I guess the way the government sees it is that when you have a mortgage, you're paying interest, but you're also paying to secure an asset. So some of your mortgage payment is just paying the bank for your own asset. So it's different to paying rent. But yeah, there's no mortgage assistance from Centrelink, but there is rent assistance.
That's really clear, Rebecca. Thank you so much. Now getting down to the nitty-gritty details, can you get rent assistance in public housing?
No. So if you are in public housing, so housing that's provided by your state government, you are already getting heavily subsidised rent, and you cannot also get Commonwealth rent assistance. If you're in public housing, your rent payment is capped at 25% of household income. So that's already usually quite a lower amount than market rent. Each property will have a market rent amount linked to it, and if 25% of your household income is over market rent for that property, then you will pay market rent only. And again, some people say, well, I'm paying market rent for my house, my public housing property. Why can't I get rent assistance? If I was paying this much rent in a standard private rental, I would be getting rent assistance. But yeah, it's just the rule. You can't get rent assistance from the Commonwealth government if you are in public housing. There are a couple of other categories of housing. So some community organisations that provide housing. There's Aboriginal housing, and in those ones, because they're not public housing, you usually can get rent assistance. In those community housing arrangements, usually the housing provider, they take 25% of your household income, and then they take all of the rent assistance that you're paid in addition to that. So in that situation, the rent assistance helps to have money going back into the housing provider, into the system, so they are able to fund more housing to help maintain your property and other properties and all of that. But no, in public housing, you cannot get Commonwealth rent assistance.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Rebecca. A lot of the retired people do the lap or part lap around Australia, and I'm wondering on their behalf, can they get rent assistance and can they have boarders and lodgers?
Okay, so we're going to need to tease this out a little bit. So If you're travelling around and you're on age pension, can you get rent assistance? It depends. If you have a home, property that you live in normally, and you own that, and you have left that to travel, for the first 12 months of your travels around Australia or wherever, you are still considered a homeowner, and that property that you normally live in is your exempt home for the asset testing purposes. And so Centrelink see it as, well, you're still technically kind of living in the home. You're just temporarily vacating it to travel. So they will not pay rent assistance while you're traveling if you still keep that home as your exempt home. If you travel for longer than 12 months and you haven't moved back to your usual home, at the 12-month mark, your home is no longer considered your primary home by Centrelink. So you will be considered a non-homeowner, and the home is no longer exempt from the asset test. So the full value of your home will then be counted as an asset, and that may mean that your age pension is severely reduced or sometimes even cancelled. But then you can get rent assistance for where you're staying when you're traveling. If you're traveling in a car and staying in cabins and paying rent or site fees or whatever, you could claim rent assistance for that. If you're traveling in a caravan or a motorhome, then Centrelink actually say that that caravan is now your usual home, your primary home. So in that case, you would be considered a homeowner with the caravan or motorhome as your usual home. The value of the motorhome is exempt from the asset test. Any other assets you have, including the property that you've vacated, counts as an asset. So for a lot of people, a lot of especially capital cities in Australia, your home value is going to knock you off getting any age pension for most people. But let's say somebody was still eligible for some age pension, then you can get rent assistance for the site fees where you park your motorhome. That's quite a convoluted answer, but it sort of depends whether you have a home that you own that you're temporarily vacating. For somebody who does not own a home at all and they are travelling around in their motorhome or caravan, then yes, they could get rent assistance. If they're on age pension, their assets are below the cut-off limit, and they can get rent assistance when they're paying site fees and stuff. And it's kind of like you don't usually stay too long in one place, but the caravan park managers, they're all over this. They will have dealt with this before. They'll know the forms that Centrelink require, and they'll be able to help you fill those out and submit them to Centrelink so that you can get your rent assistance for the time that you're in that caravan park. And then you asked about, can you have boarders and lodgers? Now, this is probably getting a bit technical, but a boarder is someone who is living in your home with you, and you are providing their meals and paying, providing utilities and that kind of thing. So you technically can't have a boarder if you're not living in the home. And the same with a lodger. So a lodger is someone where, like, you're there as well. The owner of the property is in the property, and the lodger is in their own bedroom or whatever. So I would say technically, I don't think if you've got somebody living in your home while you're not there, I think that would be considered more of a renter than a lodger or a boarder. But you can, you're quite welcome to have people living in your home while you're not there. And if you are charging them some rent, then that rental income is considered for the income test for Centrelink. There are some things you can offset from that rental income. So, for example, the council rates you pay, if you have a gardener coming in on a fortnightly basis that you're paying for, you can, offset that from the rental income. So there are some things you can use to reduce the amount of rental income that Centrelink count. But yes, the rental income would be considered for the income test for Centrelink.
Amazing, Rebecca. And that 12-month rule sounds super important to know about. I must ask, can that be reset? I mean, if someone wanted to come back home for a while to re-establish their principal place of residence status and then take off again?
Yeah, if you have sort of genuinely moved back into your home and you are living there again, then yes, that would reset and then you could travel again at a later date. But I see that people are kind of trying to get around the rules, like, oh, we'll go away for 11 months and then we'll stay home for 2 months and then we'll go away again for 11 months. But if you think about it, well, what's actually going to be a better option for you in terms of your lifestyle? Like, do you really want to come back after 11 months and, kick the tenant out and, live back there again and then try and let the house out again later on? I think if you want to travel for 2 years, just travel for 2 years. And if it means that you get cut off age pension for some of that time, well, I think you just deal with it. And then I sort of see that you're better off planning, like, what do you actually want to do? And then working out how you can make the numbers work to achieve that goal, rather than trying to, like, looking at the rules and going, we'll do it this way and that way so that we don't lose any age pension. I think, you're better off planning, what do I want to do? How can I achieve what I want to do?
Such good points, Rebecca. And of course, I was thinking as well, which may be beyond the scope of this episode, there are people that travel for a long, long time and there's something called a 6-year rule, but perhaps that's just something we need to know about.
The 6-year rule is to do with the tax office and capital gains tax. It's nothing to do with Centrelink. Yeah, I'm not going to comment on how you can use the 6-year rule, but if you talk to your accountant about the 6-year rule and they'll be able to explain how that helps you to reduce or avoid capital gains tax.
Yeah, that's such a good call. Next, we would like to know about retirement villages where someone is paying a service fee. Can people claim any sort of rent assistance or have boarders or lodgers in this scenario?
So with retirement villages, there's a couple of different categories. So retirement villages, that is a specific term relating to a specific type of accommodation setup. And there's separate to retirement villages is a lifestyle village or a land lease community or a lifestyle community. They're separate categories of housing, and the legal structure of them is quite different to each other, and they are assessed differently by Centrelink. So for a retirement village, you pay an entry contribution, which is the amount you pay to get into the village, and you don't pay rent for the land because you are, in some situations, you're like a co-owner of the land, or sometimes you just have a leasehold arrangement over the land as well as the unit or apartment that you live in. So you are not technically paying rent. Yes, you often pay a weekly service fee. And whether or not you can get rent assistance for that service fee, it depends on how much you paid as the entry contribution. So the current cap for entry contribution is $258,000. So if you were moving in this year to a retirement village and the entry contribution is more than $258,000, then you would be considered a homeowner for Centrelink purposes, and the amount you paid as an entry contribution is exempt from the asset test, and you are not eligible for rent assistance for that weekly service fee. On the other hand, if you have paid less than $258,000 for your entry contribution, Centrelink will consider you a non-homeowner, and the amount you paid is classed as an asset. You have the non-homer asset test, which is a higher asset limit, and you are eligible for rent assistance for the weekly service fee. There's these sort of two sets of rules depending on how much you paid as the entry contribution. So if you're looking at moving into a retirement village or a lifestyle village, there's a huge amount of rules you need to get your head around, and you should have professional advice to talk you through those rules, talk you through the implications of it. There's so much going on with entry fees and exit fees and weekly service fees and what you get for your money. There's lots and lots and lots of detail in that, which I cannot go into. I can just talk about the rent assistance side of it. And then the other type of accommodation is like a lifestyle village or land lease community. So that's where you own the structure. It's often a manufactured home or a movable home. You own the physical building, but you do not own the land that it sits on. And there is an arrangement where you pay rent for the land and also pay a weekly service fee. So in that situation, you are considered a homeowner for Centrelink purposes. You've bought your home, the manufactured home that sits on the land that you're renting. And because you're renting the land, you can get rent assistance for the weekly fees you pay for rent. So it's kind of this weird situation where you are both a homeowner and paying rent. So in that situation, yes, you can get rent assistance even though you're technically a homeowner for Centrelink purposes. Now, the amount of rent assistance you get, Centrelink kind of says, well, if you're paying a really low amount of rent, then you can afford to do that just on your pension and you don't need any rent assistance. So, for instance, if you were paying, let's say you were paying $100 a fortnight to rent the land on which your little house sits, Centrelink go, well, $100 is a really low amount of rent and you can afford to do that without any rent assistance. It's only when your weekly rent or fortnightly rent goes over a certain threshold that you start to be eligible for an amount of rent assistance. So there's different thresholds and caps and things for rent assistance. But if you're paying an extremely low rate of rent, you won't be eligible for rent assistance. But if you're paying over a threshold amount, then you can get some.
That's super interesting. Thanks so much, Rebecca. And I'll timestamp this next question. We are recording in November of 2025. And perhaps you just want to answer this with giving a couple of examples if there are too many different scenarios. But how much rent assistance does someone actually get?
So we're talking about age pension generally. So I'll give the amounts that you would get with age pension. So if you are a single person living alone and you pay more than $152 a fortnight in rent, you can get up to $215 a fortnight in rent assistance. The amount of rent assistance you get is 75 cents for every dollar of rent over that threshold amount. So the threshold for a single person is $152. So the rent assistance subsidises part of the extra cost of rent. But, rents are crazy. Rent amounts are crazy. And a lot of people are paying well over the maximum at the rent ceiling, the higher threshold for rent assistance. So like for a single person living alone, that caps out at $439 per fortnight of rent. Now, most people are paying a lot more than $439 to rent a place on their own. So the rent assistance caps out at $215. So it's not a lot when you consider the amount of rent people are paying nowadays. If you are single and you share your home with another adult on age pension, you get a lower rate of rent assistance because the government kind of says, well, you're sharing the cost of housing with somebody, so you don't really need as much rent assistance. So for a single person sharing, the maximum fortnightly rent assistance amount is $143.60. Because you're sort of got a benefit of sharing those costs with the other person or other people that you're living with, they pay you a lower rate of rent assistance. If you were on disability pension or carer payment, you aren't subject to those sharer rates and you would just get the full single rate of rent assistance. If you are part of a couple, then the rent assistance amount is a bit different. You Centrelink say you can afford up to $246 a fortnight of rent, and rent over that amount, they will pay some rent assistance, and the cap is $516 a fortnight of rent, and the maximum rate of rent assistance for a couple is $203, and that's the combined amount. So if you and your partner are both on a pension, you'll get half of that each, so it's $101.50 each per fortnight. If you're part of a couple when only one of you is on age pension, the other person maybe is not on a pension at all, or maybe they're on a job seeker payment. In that situation, the person on pension will get all of the rent assistance, so they'll get the $203, and the person on job seeker will get nothing, because it's just because they can pay you more with the pension, so they always pay you, as much as they can, really.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Can I also ask, is there a guide for how much to charge boarders and lodgers?
No, there's not from Centrelink. So we sort of touched on boarders and lodgers before, but so some people will rent out a room in their home, or maybe they have a family member living with them. And that might be like to make some extra money, or it might just be for companionship, or it might be because your family member needs a place to stay. You can charge board or lodgings, and depending on who the person is and how closely related they are to you, and how much you are charging them for board or lodgings or rent, and the costs of having them there, depending on all those factors, will depend on how much of that money is considered income for Centrelink purposes. So I guess the easiest or the simplest arrangement is if you have a close family member living with you in your home, and by close family, that's like a first degree relative. So your parent, your sibling, or your child. So if it's a first degree relative, and that can also be like a step parent, or a half brother, or a stepchild. If you have one of those close family members living with you and you charge them board or lodgings, that is not considered income for Centrelink purposes, because it's considered a domestic arrangement, and they're not going to try and dock your pension because you've got your adult son living with you and he's chipping in for what it costs to have him there. But when the person is not a close family member, that's when it starts to become considered income. So it can be a family member that's not first degree. So if you have a cousin living with you or a grandchild, they would not be considered close family. So if you're charging them board, then you would need to report that to Centrelink, and then they'll work out how much of that board counts as income. They'll work out your other costs of having them there and work out how much counts as income. And then it might be a completely unrelated person. Maybe it's just a friend or a housemate that you've got an arrangement with. Then the full amount of what you charge them is looked at for this income test. But Centrelink knows that when you are sharing your home with somebody, there's costs associated with that. So, all of the money they pay you can't be considered income, because you've got to pay utilities, you've got to pay for your power bill, your gas, you've got to pay your council rates and all of that stuff. So Centrelink has a bit of an easy guide. So the amount that you charge the person for lodgings or board, depending on what you provide for the person, Centrelink will be able to adjust the amount before they consider it as income. So if you are charging lodgings only, so that's just the accommodation, Centrelink counts 70% of the amount you charge as income. If you're providing bed and breakfast, so you're providing the accommodation and you're providing breakfast for the person, then Centrelink count 50% of that as income. And if you are providing full board, so you're providing accommodation and all meals in addition to breakfast, because of the cost of the food that you're providing, only 20% of that amount is treated as income. So if you're charging somebody $400 a week for full board, you're providing accommodation and all meals. So because of the cost of the food and I guess the work that you're providing to make those meals, only 20% of that amount is counted as income. So for instance, if you were charging someone $400 a week as board, that's only $80 a week that counts as income for Centrelink purposes. So $80 a week, $160 a fortnight. And that is below the income-free area for a single person. So if you had no other income, you could have a boarder in with you and be charging them $400 a week, and it doesn't affect your age pension at all. So because some people go, oh, I can't have a boarder in because Centrelink will just count that as income and they'll dock my payment. Well, no, not necessarily, because they only count some of the amount that you charge as income. So you could get a fair amount of extra money from sharing your home with someone or providing board or providing lodgings without it actually impacting your pension amount. And there's other costs too. So if you still have a mortgage on your property, the interest you pay on that mortgage can be offset from the rent amount. So even less of the money counts as income. Not the mortgage payment itself, like the principal amount that you pay, that is not able to be offset, just the interest portion.
This is super interesting, and I think it really shows how much of an incentive financially there is for sharing your home with someone. And just to be clear, are you actually allowed to charge rent and board?
So rent is usually when you are renting out like the whole property to somebody, or if you have, say you had a self-contained granny flat in the backyard and you were renting that out, that means they have access to that whole area. Rent usually means that there's a rental agreement and the person has sort of full use of the property and they pay their own utilities. So usually when we're talking about having somebody like income from somebody who's in your home, it's usually not rent, it's board or lodgings. So no, you don't usually have rent and board, because the person's either boarding and you're providing their meals, or it's a bed and breakfast thing, or it's a lodging. So I guess you've got to figure out, like, what am I providing for this person and how am I going to set up the arrangement, the paperwork, whatever, and then that will inform how much of it counts as income.
Terrific, Rebecca. And what about capital gains tax if you have lodgers and boarders?
That would be a question for your accountant. Yeah, I don't know how that works for tax purposes. So it would be prudent to have a chat with your accountant about that, whether there's going to be any impact on paying tax at some point if you sell the property, or also if if what you're charging is counted as taxable income, you would need to talk to your accountant about that. I can really only help with the Centrelink side of things.
And you have certainly been so helpful. And this answer leads well into the disclaimer again. This is always information only and never personal advice. Rebecca, what about homestay students? What actually are they and how do they fit into all this?
So a homestay student is usually like an international student who is spending either just a short time, like a few weeks in Australia as part of an exchange program, or sometimes a longer period, like 6 months or 12 months. And they stay with Australian families. They stay, in the home with Australian families as a way of firstly providing accommodation so they can stay somewhere safe while they're studying at high school or sometimes university. And also so they can get an experience of Australian life. So, what is it like to live in Australia? What sort of things do people do in the evenings, on the weekends, that kind of thing. And so if you are a homestay host, you have 1 or 2 or sometimes even 3 students living in your home with you, and you provide their accommodation and you provide their meals. And you're also expected to provide sort of emotional support and activities for them to do, and show them your community, show them you're part of Australia. And like, some people really love doing this because it's a way of having more social interaction. It's a way of investing into the lives of these young people. It can be really interesting to learn about the customs of people from other cultures. And you can be paid for this arrangement. So the homestay organisation pays a weekly amount to cover the expenses that are associated with hosting that student. Now, for Centrelink purposes, if you have one homestay student at a time, they kind of say, well, you're going to be spending most of that money on the costs of having the student with you, whether that's like the food that they're eating, the electricity bill, and the activities that you're doing with them, like showing them around some tourist spots or whatever it is. So with just one student, it's not counted as income at all. So some people on a pension enjoy doing this as something that adds to their life and also provides a bit of extra money without it impacting their Centrelink payment. If you have 2 or 3 students at once, the amount that you get from the homestay organisation is, I believe, is just a certain amount per student. So, you're going to have double the amount for 2 students or triple the amount for 3. But the costs are not going to be doubled or tripled because some of the costs are kind of shared. So you're going to have a bit more of a profit, if you like, when you've got 2 or 3 students. So in that situation, for Centrelink purposes, you would provide a bit of a profit and loss statement showing what your expenses are for having the students compared to the amount of payment that you're getting, and only the profit would be assessed as income. So it's a bit of a niche thing, I suppose, but in some areas there are homestay programs running, and some people really do enjoy participating in that program as a cultural exchange kind of thing. And it can be done to get you a bit of extra income with very minimal impact on your Centrelink payments. And my understanding is that those payments, the homestay payments, are tax-free, so they are not counted as income for tax purposes. And that's one incentive that the government has to encourage people to take up the offer of being a host.
That is so interesting, Rebecca. This has been jam-packed full of information. For our international listeners wishing to join our Facebook group, the code word is orange. And as always, this is information only and not personal advice. Thank you so very much, Rebecca.
Not a problem. Hope people have found this helpful.